All right. Well, let's get started. So, welcome everyone. Really excited to see all the different names trickle in, some of whom I know and some of whom I don't know. For those of you who I don't know, first off, welcome to this event. Really excited to have this conversation. My name is Carolyn Witte. I'm the CEO and co founder of TIA. If you're not familiar with TIA, we are the modern medical home for women, a next gen women's healthcare platform reinventing how women's healthcare is accessed, experienced, and delivered online and in real life, and very committed to the conversation we're going to talk about today, which is reproductive rights and the future of choice for women in America. So this is a topic that is very passionate to me personally as a woman in the world, as a female founder who aims to create a new paradigm for modern women's healthcare and as the leader of a healthcare provider for women. And for all of those reasons, we're really excited to bring to you two of the world's leading experts on reproductive rights and reproductive freedom to talk about really what's at stake with respect to all things reproductive health in the US, the history, how we got here, but most importantly of all, what we do. And that's where I'm really excited to guide and facilitate this conversation. So to start, before we dive in, I'd like to formally introduce these two experts and give you a sense of their incredible backgrounds in this space. So with me today, we have Kathryn Kolbert, who is a women's rights attorney who co-founded the Center for Reproductive Rights and argued Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the 1992 Supreme Court case widely credited for saving Roe v. Wade. We also have Kathryn's co-author, Julie Kay, who is a women's rights attorney who has advocated for abortion rights internationally, including before the European Court of Human Rights in Ireland, which spurred expansion of abortion rights in the country. So much to learn from both of you. Kathryn, or more Kitty as she goes by, and Julie are the authors of a new book that I've been reading that I hope all of you will get a chance to read as well, called Controlling Women, What We Must Do to Save Reproductive Freedom. And it's been immersed in this myself, and really grateful for the opportunity to dive deep in this topic, deeply understand the history and what's at stake at a time when I personally have felt so helpless, I think, with respect to all the things that have been going on the last few months in particular. So the book, what the book chronicles that I think will guide the conversation we'll have here today is the challenge to Roe v. Wade since its inception, a death by a thousand pricks approach, really. And I think that's the thing that I think my big takeaway from reading the book is that while the events of the last few months, particularly SB8 in Texas, which we'll get into, Mississippi, which will be heard by the Supreme Court in the coming weeks or months, all these things feel like, in certain regards, a turning point. They're really just the next kind of stab in a long history of many attacks on reproductive freedom. And I think Julie and Kitty can put that into context and importantly guide what we should do about it as a result. So that for me was one big learning I had from reading the book. What we'll do is I came ready to ask Julie and Kitty a few questions on my mind after reading this book, but then would love to open up the conversation to all of you. So please feel free to drop in your own questions in the chat at any time, and I'll weave those in, and we'll save room for an open Q&A at the end of the conversation as well. So with all of that, thank you all again for being here, and let's get into it. So my first question, before we get into the reproductive rights attacks of today, I want to go back in time a bit and set the stage. In your book, you discuss the legal basis for Roe and its subsequent erosion, stating that Roe has been under attack since the day it went into effect. So can you help me and everyone here today really understand the foundational legal basis for Roe and why, as a result, it's fallen victim to this death by a thousand pricks approach that you describe in your book?
Okay, so Caroline, it's really nice to be here. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and for all of you who are joining us this afternoon. We're really thrilled that you are here. Let me just set the stage here. Roe versus Wade was decided by the Supreme Court in a 7-2 decision in 1973. and it established in the law kind of the highest level of constitutional protection. It meant, for the most part, that when a state passed a law that restricted women's rights or their ability to obtain an abortion, that law was unconstitutional. And Roe really served that function until about 1980, when the court began to chip away at that even more by permitting the federal government to cut off Medicaid funding for abortion, permitting restrictions on young women. And by 1992, in my case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the court was faced with a challenge to restrictions. And at that point, due to the appointment of Clarence Thomas to the court, we thought that there were 5 votes to overturn Roe. Now, I say all the time, arguing in front of the Supreme Court's a lot like Sesame Street. Why? Because you got to learn to count. And Count Dracula would say the critical number is 5. If there are 5 votes on the Supreme Court, no matter how good your arguments are, those members of the court can change the precedent, can say Roe is no longer the law. And we thought they were going to do that in 1992. And in fact, we were correct. After my oral argument, the justices voted. They decided that they were going to overrule Roe. And what that means is they would give states the permission to ban abortion. But what happened to us, as a surprise to us, and I think to most court watchers, Justice Kennedy switched his vote at the last minute. And the court instead adopted what's called an undue burden test, basically saying states can pass restrictions as long as they're not undue restrictions. But you've got to let abortion be legal up until the point of viability. That is usually around 24 to 28 weeks of pregnancy. So that's the law today. What's happened, however, in the intervening years is that more and more states have been controlled by anti-abortion legislators, and the courts have become more conservative. And therefore, we are at a point now where what's undue is defined very narrowly. Lots and lots of restrictions are in effect, and we are poised, beginning in December, when the court hears the Mississippi case, we're likely to see this court change the standard and permit states to ban all abortion, or at least most of it.
So the phrase undue burden is a phrase I've heard for a long time following the sort of, variety of attacks on reproductive rights. Can you help me understand, like, from a legal perspective, how does such an relatively ambiguous phrase like come into effect? And obviously we've seen, I think that's from where I sit as a non-lawyer on here, it feels just so loose, right? And therefore, as a result, opens itself up to attack, which I think is one of the ways that something like SB8 in Texas came into effect in the first place. Is that a fair connection to bridge?
Julie, do you want to jump
Sure.
in?
Sure, and it's great to be here as well. I think you're right, Carolyn. Intuitively, undue burden is very amorphous. The courts deal with figuring out what's reasonable, what's a standard of proof all the time. So I think, as Kitty will say, immediately after Planned Parenthood versus Casey, it was a sort of open field day. A lot of litigation that I did in the 90s was around determining exactly whether a burden is undue or not. So we saw a lot of things like waiting periods enacted, and we would go and litigate and say, this is what happens when you put a waiting period on somebody in Wisconsin or in a different state. And the problem is that you're looking at a court that often doesn't get the reality of women's lives, and especially poor women and women on the margins. They're not really attuned to a lot of the bias and barriers that people face in accessing healthcare, and particularly abortion. So something that requires somebody to make 2 trips to the clinic, because you have to go, you have a 24-hour waiting period. So you go to the clinic, then you're supposed to go home and think about it, which I think is a pretty condescending and inaccurate approach to how people make a decision about whether to have an abortion. And then you have to come back. And so for somebody in the position that has childcare, can take leave from a job, whether paid or unpaid, isn't in a situation of an abusive relationship where their movement is controlled, it's still a pain. It's still unnecessary. It still postpones an abortion procedure, particularly if the clinic only has a doctor present, once a week. So a 24-hour delay becomes a week-long delay. Sort of all this to say that if you're looking at teens, at people in rural area, at people who have poor women, people who face racial inequality in accessing healthcare, that burden goes up and up. So really, through this legal standard that you say is kind of isn't really so clearly defined, it's up to courts to decide. And when we have conservative courts and when we have anti-abortion jurists looking at this without due regard for the impact on people's lives, we end up where we are today, where abortion, the right is there, it's often very hollow, and women on the margins have a real lot of difficulty and a unequal and racially biased access to abortion.
But Carolyn, let me just add, it can get worse. Okay, it is bad for many, many people today. But what we think the court is likely to do in the upcoming cases is to say that states are free to ban all abortion or most abortions, whatever they decide they want to do, in states all across the country, not just Texas, but every state. And we think 27 states that are controlled by the Republicans that have anti-abortion legislative majorities are likely to ban abortion within a year, year and a half, maybe 2 years from the court's decision.
So when you say ban abortion, do you mean more SB8s in terms of a ban at 6 weeks, which, to be clear, is the vast majority of women don't even know they're pregnant by that 6-week mark, which is one of the reasons that is the Texas law has been called, for all intents and purposes, an all-out abortion ban. Is that what you see, that type of law scaling across the country?
I see states returning to the days before Roe when all abortions were banned, except maybe for life endangerment, and some states may say rape and incest. Each state's going to have a different political calculation, but the reality is it will be functionally unavailable for all women in those states legally. Now,
because the Supreme Court sets the floor. I mean, they can't say they can say we're not having any federal right and access to abortion. States can say more, but as Kitty's indicating, a lot of states already have laws on the books that will go into effect to ban all abortion as soon as the federal protection is no longer there. And then other states, some blue states, will become sort of hubs for abortion services and will still provide services, but will be way outnumbered by the red and some purple states that decide to put severe limitations on access.
So just to reiterate and perhaps translate, in summary, it sounds like with the Mississippi court case in particular, which will be heard at the Supreme Court, the risk really that we face is that the federal precedent or protection, I should say, for Roe risks is more than likely to be overturned, which means that it will fall to the states. And as a result, flash forward a year or two from now, what we could have is an even more divided country than we have today, with red states and blue states having acting on their own volition, blue states perhaps becoming more progressive with respect to the ways in which they support reproductive access, and perhaps, I want to get to this in a moment, what they must do to support those in red states, as well in red states pushing forth all-out bans. Is that a fair summary of a little bit of what you're predicting here?
Yes, absolutely.
Before we get to, I want to come to, well, what do we do about that very, very harrowing future? I want to come back to today. It's a day-by-day situation. It's October 21st. What, if anything, can we do to prevent that from happening?
Well, the most important thing we can do is to quit relying on the courts to save us. The reproductive freedom movement over the last 40 years has been built on a save Roe, save Roe, save Roe. That's been the mantra. That's been what everybody has been focused on. So the thing we can do is first and foremost quit depending on the federal courts. As Julie loves to say, they're just not that into you. Okay.
I want to interrupt you and like just for everyone to reiterate, particularly for those who may be joining recently, this is coming from two lawyers, including yourself, who argued Casey versus Planned Parenthood in the Supreme Court.
That's
and you're basically saying, don't trust the courts?
Don't trust the courts. Don't trust the federal courts. You will have no federal constitutional right. And that's something that almost everybody on this call, is my guess, has relied upon their entire lives. It has been the law for almost 50 years. And so it is very, very difficult to imagine that there is no constitutional protection, but that's where we're headed. So one of the things, the first thing we tell people is you got to start looking for other ways to protect your rights. And first and foremost, that's politics, getting down and dirty in politics and making sure we elect legislators who are supportive of reproductive health. That's helping the women in the bad states. And that's building a social justice movement that's strong enough to make social change. And we're going to get into the details of all of that, Caroline. But I think the most important thing is for everyone to understand that we can't depend on the federal courts to protect us any longer.
And I would add to that, I mean, one thing that we can do today and that we will do in this very event is start talking about the issue the way it really is. I mean, we've named the book Controlling Women because we know that this issue is about controlling the most intimate decisions that people make about their lives, when and whether to have children, with whom, and how to raise those children safely, and have the kind of supports and sustainability in our families that everybody wants. So these are sort of our basic fundamental human rights. And you know, we're often told this is a religious debate, or this is about philosophical questions about when life begins. But no, this is a human rights issue that really has gender equity at its core and has implications for racial equity, LGBTQ plus rights. And we know that people, I think, especially what I love about talking about you all and about people in the healthcare field is, you know, how essential these rights are. If you don't have control over your bodily integrity, you don't have control over your life. And so we really want people to start talking about this much more as a basic human rights issue that we already all know that it is.
So let's dive into that a little bit more in more detail before we get to the what do we do about this part of the conversation. We at TIA, we're an organization that's we describe ourselves as an all options organization with respect to every decision a woman may make about her health, inclusive of but not limited to reproductive rights. So being a choice is core to everything we do, whether that's deciding if to get pregnant, when to get pregnant, how to end a pregnancy, your birth plan, how to support your anxiety, depression, any decision a woman may make, we take an all options view. And I think what we believe, sort of the erosion, the threat to our values as an organization comes when those options are limited. And I think what makes me the most fearful of this future world that you're describing is this very, very divided world, not just between red states and blue states, but the reality of what would happen there is, let's be real about who that's going to affect. That's going to affect low-income women of color who are not able to get on an airplane and go to New York or California to access the reproductive healthcare services, as an example. And so I wanted to cite a piece of sort of a research that I recently read that TIA put forth in our community and sparked an interesting conversation, and see what your perspective on this. And you had presumably more data around this, around the economic impact that women face for those who are denied abortion. So the research we read from those published by UCSF was that women who are denied abortions are 4 times more likely to live in poverty, 3 times more likely to experience unemployment than those with access to abortion. And I think what that data is really telling us is, remove that choice, and the domino effect is not just on bodily autonomy, it's not just on a specific reproductive life event, but your entire life and that of your children, your family, and your community, and so forth. And so as experts who've seen this happen time and time again, what else can how do we let that data really sink in as we think about what do we need to do really in the importance of taking action to protect access and increase access to reproductive healthcare services so that we can mitigate, let's say, that domino effect.
Well, Caroline, one of the things I am very clear about is you're absolutely right about who is currently affected. And in fact, that will be true going forward, even to a greater extreme. But all women are affected here. This is not just low-income women who will be affected. Why? Because the legal protections that we're talking about losing really go both to decisions to terminate a pregnancy and decisions to become pregnant, and control that in your life as well. And so one of the things we've seen with the pandemic that's been so extreme is that women who have children are leaving the workforce in huge numbers because they don't have the social supports they need to decide to have families or to continue to have families. So, they're doing the lion's share of the child care while trying to work. Their husbands are working too, but are doing less. And that has meant that many, many women have quit their jobs because they can't do it all. And so I think one of the things that's really important here is for us to think about these rights broadly, not just abortion, but a wide range of issues affecting pregnancy and childbearing and families. And second, to make sure that we think about all the things that need to be done, both to help the most disempowered, the most vulnerable women, as well as others who are affected by these punitive efforts.
I think what I like about that approach, and kind of get into some of the recommendations you put forth, is I think there's this constant struggle in the feminist movement and the women's healthcare movement around the centricity of abortion. Is it the issue? Is it the only issue? How is it connected to every other issue? And you really can't separate it from so many issues. But what I really like about what you put forth as a recommendation is we must think about access to abortion services, abortion care, reproductive health care services within a broader suite of women's rights, health equity, racial justice, LGBTQ inclusion, and so forth. So with that,
can I just say, Caroline, I mean, one of the things while you were talking about what Tia does, I was thinking sort of in your end of things, you've done that in the health arena of that often health, mental health is separated off from physical health, especially around pregnancy and childbearing. And so I think that kind of holistic approach in the medical system and in treating patients needs to be there and looking at our legal rights. And it's a smart way to go because it'll help us in the political arena to bring in more allies. We talk in the book a lot about the successes of the LGBTQ plus marriage equality work and Black Lives Matters and how they've brought in allies and really worked, in partnership. And we need to do more of that. We need to bring, abortion rights front and center with a reproductive freedom approach, and one that recognizes the right to have children, and how childcare and safety in your neighborhoods and food security and housing security are so much part of these decisions that people are making.
Absolutely. Last year, we ran a study in the lead up to the presidential election where we surveyed thousands and thousands of women in every state, blue states, red states, across political views, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, so age, and so forth. And we asked women, what is the number one issue on your mind that you want the next president of the United States to address when it comes to your health? And the number one issue was not anything that most people would think of as healthcare. It was childcare and access to affordable, healthy food. That was higher ranked than OBGYNs, than all these other things. And I was so taken aback. Yes, I was taken aback and I wasn't taken aback, but it was an interesting narrative adjustment. And it's like, this is so obvious. Why don't we think of these things as healthcare? But to real women in the world, when they're thinking in the midst of the pandemic, what's actually affecting the health of themselves and their children, their families, it's those things. And what if we broaden our view as a society from a policy perspective, from a legal perspective, from I could go on, and really thought, okay, well, what is health? It's all of these things. How do we actually build a society that allows women, families, everyone to achieve their health goals, and it involves investing in all these sorts of systems that are currently failing women disproportionately, as we're seeing today. So very, very aligned with that with that view. So with that, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the ideas that I know this is a depressing, a scary topic, a harrowing topic for many, but I actually, reading your book, left inspired. I know that's not the word that most people would think about when talking about reproductive rights at this time in America, but I want to give you guys the chance to talk about why that is. And one of the particular ideas you put forth is an ambitious alternative to one that is dependent on our federal courts, which is a gender equity amendment to the Constitution. So can you share the sort of concept behind this? What does that entail? And why do you think that is an ambitious yet fundamentally necessary approach to address not only access to abortion services or reproductive health care, but this broader approach to women's health and well-being as we've been describing?
Yeah, I mean, the Gender Equity Amendment goes exactly to what we've been describing. If you look at the US Constitution, our so-called founding fathers did not design it with women and people of color in mind. And so it's time for some renovating. We've done a lot, I think, with the existing Constitution, but as Kitty was saying earlier on, Roe versus Wade is founded in the right to privacy, and that these kinds of decisions around reproductive freedom go much more broadly into our daily existence, our liberty, our full bodily integrity and participation in the world. The reproductive justice movement, which is kind of the wing of the abortion rights movement that was started in the late 80s and 90s by women of color and led by Black women, really adopted a human rights approach very early on. And they sort of understood this from their own lived experience of the structural inequalities around gender and race that affected their rights. And so, you know, I've worked a lot in the international arena around human rights, and it makes sense because it puts an affirmative duty on the government to make sure that the programs and resources are there that will bring everybody up to at least this baseline of having access to, you know, your basic human rights. And so this is a long-term goal, and we're quite straightforward about that in the book. We don't have one specific clause that we've drafted. We kind of envision it as a supercharged ERA, and it needs a lot more minds together and being put into the language. We look at a lot of different examples. Vermont has something coming down the road for their constitution that could be on the ballot as early as next year or the year after, that would have that kind of affirmative gender equity amendment language. South Africa has a great provision in their constitution. This has been done. And what it would do in the US, if we were eventually to get it into our constitution, is really to kind of upgrade a lot of our rights to this highest level of fundamental rights that the court would then have to pay attention, even if these justices, these 6 ultra-conservative and fairly young justices are still there, they would have to pay attention to this provision of the Constitution and really do a much better job of recognizing the gender inequities.
So Carolyn, I think the other piece of this, though, is what we're really saying is we need a plan. We need a short-term plan, we need a medium-term plan, and we need a long-term plan. And our opponents have done that. They started 50 years ago when even before Roe was decided, developing ways to chip away at that right, and eventually have gotten to the point where they'll be successful. And we need to do the same. And part of doing that is to think very broadly about what's our end goal. What do we really want? Not just the little things along the way.
How, Julie, you mentioned the term supercharged ERA. So I'd love to understand, for the audience, particularly those who haven't read your book yet, what are the key differences between the gender equity amendment you're proposing and the ERA of the past? And also, what can we learn from the failures of the ERA in terms of actually, it obviously didn't come into effect. So in terms of the strategy to actually achieve this long term, what can we learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hesitant to call the ERA a failure because we're still talking about it and thinking about it. I think the political movement, it was very powerful. Carolyn, I'm also thinking that you had missed going to law school by a hair, and I'm not saying that was a bad decision given what you've built, but I will try to kind of keep a simple response, and we, in the book do try to not talk like lawyers too much. But The idea is really that instead of just saying everything has to be equal because of sex, but looking more broadly at how we treat people, what kind of access to resources, what are some of the structural inequalities that they have to overcome. So it would be language much more based in equity, which doesn't mean that everybody gets the same, exact amount, but that people get what they need more of. So it's really looking more longer term, because yes, the ERA did not pass in part because of the politics of the day, the far right. And I don't know if people know more about Phyllis Schlafly because of the new television series on her, but there was a lot of fear mongering around it in many ways of what we're still seeing in reaction to some of the trans rights work that's being done, of these just kind of overblown, exaggerated, trying to tell people, and especially women, that you'll lose the pedestal you're on if you're held equal. And so I think we need to have a conversation that's much more modern and talking about less about fear and more about rights. And I'm optimistic. It is I think it's a 20+ year plan. Kitty says it's more like a 50-year plan. Somewhere between in the middle is probably that. And if we don't elect the people who are going to be on our side on this in the short run as well as in the long run, then it stays a pipe dream. But I do think that it's the way the world is going towards a more proactive human rights approach, less based on privity and equality and more looking at equity and really looking at how one's income affects one's access to rights.
Right, and I think historically, when the most recent ERA debate happened, reproductive rights were not explicitly included, certainly not abortion rights, in the way it was being interpreted. It's changed now. What's currently in Congress, the women and men who are supporting it have changed their view. But the reality is we need to have a coalition of people who believe in racial justice, who believe in LGBTQ rights, along with women, to be able to make this happen. And we need to have them all excited about it so that we can build the political power that's necessary.
And part of that is being good partners with them too. I mean, we need to stand up for the rights of undocumented immigrants. We need to be there for Black Lives Matter protests. We need to have a two-way street approach to bringing in allies.
Yes, absolutely. You mentioned the success in certain regards I would say, let's say, major milestones that have moved forward the LGBTQ movement, specifically around marriage equality and so forth. What can we learn from that in terms of women's rights, in particular reproductive rights for all people?
Well, I think there's a couple of things we can learn. Social justice movements change people's minds. Telling stories about how laws affect real people really help. The beauty of the marriage equality movement was that we were flooded with stories of happiness of all these people who wanted to get married and who were denied the ability to do so. That made a difference. But most importantly, what we've learned both with Black Lives Matter and with the marriage equality movement is that political power, winning in the courts, in the legislatures, in the political arena, is central to winning your rights going forward. So the marriage equality movement was very strategic. They worked on defeating laws at the state level, passing marriage equality at the state level. They then went to Congress and thought about changing the law there. But the point was it was a multi-dimensional effort, and it was grounded in the stories of real people. And most importantly, it was a mass movement so everyone could contribute. And we've seen really interesting efforts, and I'm going to let Julie talk about this because of her experience in Ireland, but we've seen really interesting mass movements in Argentina, in Poland, in Ireland, in Mexico, that women have gotten together and collectively demanded that they have more protections. And it's been really, really, I find it inspiring in ways that I think we need to move here.
Yeah, I think in this country, to start with, those mass movements, when they've had a sort of tangible core of a political ask, have been most successful. Marriage equality was not uncontroversial as the ask of the LGBTQ plus movement, and there was a lot of controversy. Why aren't we looking for workplace anti-discrimination provisions, those kinds of things? And I think that is, for a movement to determine for itself of what is the ask. But I will say I saw in the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020 in New York, there were signs that said repeal 50A. And I was thrilled. I mean, 50A is this very, narrow provision in New York law that says that you don't report out when police officers have had charges against them. So there was the broader defund the police slogan. There was Black Lives Matter generally, but they managed to get 50A repealed because they put a spotlight on it. And so I think having some kind of wonky policy ask is always important. In the latest women's marches, there was a lot of movement to push for the Women's Health Protection Act, which is, stuck in the Senate, and we'll see what happens there. But I think knowing what we want and what it looks like, whether it's the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which is before the Senate now, which has more bipartisan support, fortunately, and that would provide some accommodations for women in the workplace who are people who are pregnant. Those kinds of core asks are important to have. And what we've seen happening globally, I think in these so-called Catholic countries, we've seen women who, some of whom identify as Catholic and have deeply held beliefs, but they know that they differ from their religious elders and the men who would say that abortion is never acceptable, and they're pushing for their rights, and they're showing up. The green bandanas that have been seen throughout Latin and Central America have been a wonderful kind of show of this support. And I was really fortunate to work in Ireland around a lot of the movement building that was mass protests, and it was backed by political engagement, electing more women to office, and also the litigation that I brought really let us put it solidly in a human rights framework as well, and bring an edict that the government had to do better.
Well, I want to ask one more question and then open it up to the audience for a Q&A. So while I do this, please start putting your questions in the chat. I think what I guess my last question, maybe each of you can answer this, is what is one thing that everyone here today can do, like today? I know I personally feel like I'm in a holding period, like just like waiting for this court case, right? And trying to see, contingency plan mode. What do we do next? What do we do from there? And I think what you said today, you're already ahead of that in many regards. And I think it can be easy for all of us to feel helpless, right? Like, I voted, I participated, all these people were elected. Look at the Supreme Court. I don't control that anyway. It's out of my hands. How do we change that narrative, stay inspired, stay motivated, and focus on one or two or three things that each of us here can do to move these rights in this movement forward?
So, Carolyn, first and foremost, in my view, is we can have the most wonderful policy ideas, but if we don't have politicians in office who have the power to enact them, we are nowhere. So the one thing I would suggest everybody do is remember that elections happen, not just every 4 years or not just every 2 years, but every 6 months. And we need to become politically active. How do you do that? Go find a candidate you love and go work in their campaign. Write postcards, go canvass, send money. There's all kinds of ways to be politically active, but electoral politics, however much liberals have always been nervous about getting involved in them, you got to today. That's really where the action's going to be. So highest on my list is making sure that all of us get off the couch, grab a friend, go join an organization, or just work for groups that are ensuring the election of not just people who are pro-choice, but people who are champions for our cause.
I would say what one other thing will you do today, because I think talking about and learning about this issue is super important. I think one of the reasons we've gotten to where we are is because we were all kind of hoodwinked into thinking everything was fine, and it's not. But we're doing something, we're taking action. I think part of what we like best with our conversations is when they spur action. We did a talk last night for a local bookstore, and one of my friends emailed me this morning and said, my daughter's travel volleyball team is supposed to go to a tournament in Texas in April, and I want to protest, and Adidas is sponsoring it, and we're going to start a petition, all these things. And what should I do? I was like, well, that's what you should do. I mean, don't deny the girls going to the tournament, but it's a long time until April, and make some noise. And so a lot of it is figuring out what fits and what fits for you. And, in some ways, Kitty and I are preaching to the choir because people are already interested in learning. And I think for those of you in the healthcare field, a big part of it is thinking creatively about how can we get better access to medication abortion, both for the people in our state and in our own local place that need it. If we're in a blue state and it's easy, if we're not in a blue state and it's hard, but it's still available, how can we expand it so that people who are working low-wage jobs and can't take time off can access medication abortion after hours, can use telemedicine? How can we make sure that people have access to abortion medication? Maybe put it in their medicine cabinet and wait for a rainy day or one for a friend. We're entering into a new world. We're not going back to the pre-Roe world as far as healthcare services, because medication abortion is a real option for people before 11 weeks of pregnancy. And I think if everybody is bringing their own viewpoint and their energy level and their friends to coming up with solutions, and voting, I think the voting and getting involved in mailing postcards. And I live in New York and Brooklyn, so I often go meet Kitty in Pennsylvania and go door to door to door to door to door to door. But I think, find something that fits for you and that uses your skill set.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. So I'm going to start posing some of the questions from the audience, and please keep putting your questions in chat. So Julie, you started to touch on this with the aspects of medication abortion, but there's a question around, I think there's a focus on the political stuff and then the healthcare stuff, right? Abortion is both first and foremost a healthcare issue. Abortion is healthcare. We say that all the time. And I believe that as someone who is building a healthcare company. And so there's the reality is that we got to elect these candidates. We have to, work on, this longer term constitutional amendment, but every single day, there are people who are pregnant and don't want to be. And what do we do? How do we service those people today in a very volatile world? And you mentioned two things that are related that I wanted to help explain a little bit more, particularly for those who may be less familiar about some of the changing healthcare policies here. One is medication abortion, and one is telemedicine. And those two things are not the same, but you can put those two things together and create a lot of access to safe abortion services for lots of people in a lot of places. But there are a lot of challenges with it, both from a clinical perspective, a legal perspective, and an operational perspective. So could either of you speak a little bit about what's changed there in the medication abortion space from a policy perspective, as has, particularly the last 18 months of the pandemic? We've seen a massive surge in telehealth as a whole, and specifically how this can be used to increase access, particularly in an increasingly restrictive world.
Right. So the biggest change as a result of the pandemic is that the FDA changed the rules for how medication abortion can be dispensed. Under the old rules, a woman had to go to a doctor's office to get the pills. That was changed during the pandemic. I think the FDA rightfully acknowledged that this was a burden on many women. Why not just be able to go to a drugstore to pick them up, or go have their doctor get them to them in some other way? And so that has opened up more and more providers being interested in providing medication abortion, although not enough in our view, because of course almost any doctor could prescribe the drug. So in my view, one of the things that we need to do going forward is, if you assume abortion is banned in over half the states which are the blue states need to widen the availability of medication abortion dramatically, so that in some ways you flood the market, you make it easier for people to get. And women are very creative, right? I mean, it's not like they can travel to the other state, but they have creative ways to self-medicate and get those drugs. And so it seems to me broadening who can provide and who does provide medication abortion is key. My favorite law is California's, which says every student health center at every University of California campus has to provide medication abortion. I think we should be pushing every university to do that, particularly in the states where abortion is legal.
And we've also, Kitty and I have worked on allowing cases to allow mid-level providers to perform surgical abortions as well. And I think that's something to really think about, both with medication and surgical abortion, of looking at in friendly states where we can expand. And New York has had success with that, as well as some other states. But more access for more people is important.
I think one of the things you're posing here, and as again, the founder of a healthcare company who's in the thick of cross-state regulation and malpractice and all of this stuff, it's very complicated to navigate. And there's no medical reason why we can't prescribe medication abortion on the internet and mail it to your house. We can do that. We've been able to do that for a long time. It's all legal. In perception and sometimes confusion around what you can and can't do, which is one of the reasons many providers are uncomfortable oftentimes. It's like, well, it's legally gray, right? And when it comes to telemedicine abortion, I think I'll get into some of these questions specifically around criminalization in a second that are being posed in the chat. But first, I want to talk a little bit about telehealth regulation in general and some of the shifts that we're seeking here. We are a healthcare company. There's a lot of healthcare providers here today listening. I know, for example, in Texas, or at least 4 weeks ago, the telemedicine abortion was a big focal point as a solution, or one of those tools in the toolkit we need to deploy to fill the access gap that we're seeing as a result of SB8. Yet at the same time, you can't prescribe across state lines in Texas. So it is illegal, effectively, to be a provider in California and prescribe, medication abortion to someone in Texas, in the state of Texas. So what you're having to do is, okay, well, we can do that, but someone actually has to leave Texas, go to New Mexico, or go to Oklahoma, or all these other barriers. So it is a complex operation. It is one step forward, but it's not a silver bullet. So are there been other, that's a particularly restrictive environment. There have been some other changes, or do you anticipate what we can, advocate for on the telehealth regulation side that could actually allow those blue states to pick up for the red states in a world where Roe is overturned, and we need to make it easier for telemedicine as one solution to become, let's say, more impactful logistically, let's say, than it is today?
I mean, it's the kind of creative solutions that we're talking about. I mean, we are entering a new era. I worked when I was in Ireland and living in Ireland, and abortion was banned. We had a Women on Waves abortion ship project that I worked closely with the Dutch doctor who had a clinic on a ship, and it was a fully outboarded clinic. And we would pick up, the idea of the plan was you pick up women in the port in Dublin and go out into international waters 12 miles out to sea and either deliver pills, or if the waters were calm, do surgical abortion and come back into port. It ended up bringing more attention than abortion services, but the number of women who were willing and able and would rather do that than travel abroad to England or have to go by themselves to Spain or those kinds of things was phenomenal. And people will, find ways. I think Kitty and I talk a bit in the book about an example of a leader of indigenous native tribe who was talking about doing abortion, having an abortion clinic on the reservation. There's some, real issues there about making sure that that's, truly coming from the people on the reservation and that it fits the local community. But it is one of those sort of creative ways that this woman was thinking of where federal law didn't apply. So I'm not Jeff Bezos. I'm not saying let's get a rocket ship and take women up to give them a pill, but I think there's going to be a lot more legal creativity. There's going to be a lot of the blue states who have to, recognize that they need to step up. And I think, you all as healthcare providers, and that you're in the thick of it and in the weeds of the regulations, are going to be well suited because you're looking to provide the service, and many, many doctors and medical providers are not. And so I think that's important to speak to your colleagues, to bring people along and really start looking affirmatively at things that, fit with your current practice.
And I think the other issue here is women just need information. Okay, so all kinds of doctors and volunteers, all of us, can provide good, accurate information to women in need, which will help them to decide how they want to handle the problem. And that's really key going forward. It's a gray area of the law. It will continue to be for a long period of time. Creativity is necessary, but from my point of view, increasing access in the blue states is fundamentally a sound idea that's going to ensure that women in the red states can have greater access to service, and we fund them to get there, because again, it's costly and expensive and dangerous, et cetera.
So I want to come back to this concept of information as a foundational aspect here that's essential in any world, even today. And particularly, there's a couple of questions being posed around criminalization. And I think that's one of the things that is it's a topic that there's so much fear and anxiety around it for good reason, that people don't really understand whether providers, doctors, nurse practitioners, and so forth can be criminalized, as well as patients. And so can you help us understand the differences there? And I know there's not one size fits all answer to this question. It varies state by state, but let's flash forward to a world in which Roe is in fact overturned, and the blue states are going to need to overcompensate for the red states. Are women in red states going to risk being criminalized for traveling to a blue state to, get access to abortion services?
Probably not, but it will depend on that particular state's law. But even in the days before Roe, when abortion was banned, women were not held liable for themselves getting abortions. Now, the people helping them might be liable. But again, that would all depend on the state law. And I think one of the mistakes, I don't want to go down the road of giving legal advice here, because it's not, I don't know enough. You got to be very specific about doctors, where they're living, what they're doing, what one state says, what another state says. But what I can say to you is that all of us have the responsibility to help women in need. And one of the ways we can do that is to help the organizations that are providing funding for women to travel, that are providing some of this information. There's groups like the National Network of Abortion Funds and RAP that does national, there's funds in Oklahoma and in Louisiana that are helping the clinics there that are getting some of the overflow. So I think one of the things we can do is to contribute to the people who are doing these services, and making sure that we each have appropriate and accurate information to pass on to the women in need, because that's so key.
I think you highlight one of the things that's just so complex about the space. I know one of the criticisms sometimes, even within the reproductive rights circles around telemedicine abortion, is it actually sometimes can put the surgical practices out of business, which are essential and necessary. Remember, medication abortion only works up till 10 or 11 weeks. And so if we're in a restrictive world, what happens after that point? There's lots of reasons that you may need to terminate a pregnancy after that point. And it's important that we continue to support true all options for women, which means medication and surgical options. And if that is increasingly out of reach for geographic reasons due to restrictive laws and so forth, we're going to need a multi-pronged strategy to ensure that all options are truly tenable, and we have financial and legal backing to protect those options.
And I think, Carolyn, also a lot of people choose surgical abortion in the first trimester because
that's absolutely right.
One and done. We also don't want to have physicians lose the skills to be able to do even miscarriage management, which is something we saw a lot of in Ireland. If there just was nobody who knew how to do these procedures anymore, even the first trimester ones. And I just want to go back to the criminal prosecution bit. I think not only, in some states, women might not be held criminally liable themselves, but we often see rogue prosecutors who will bring charges against women, either for trying to self-induce an abortion or for having a miscarriage that was, there's a woman in Oklahoma recently who's come to more public attention because she was prosecuted after she had a miscarriage and sentenced to jail We've seen a lot of those cases. The criminal justice system is not fair. We all know that. There's been much greater recognition of the racial bias. And I think particularly when you're looking at prosecutions around anything related to pregnancy, the racial bias and the gender bias are really can be harmful.
Yes, absolutely. So I want to take this question about engaging our communities in these topics. How do we start conversations about these sensitive topics at a time of really unprecedented polarization? This is not a men versus women's issue. As we know, there are many women that are strong advocates, I would say, proponents, I should say, against this cause. And how do we, it can feel similar to the polarization around vaccines, kind of a battle that is impossible to engage in. What have you found, how can each of us do something in terms of engaging in a conversation? What are the do's and don'ts here in terms of trying to, over time, create more alignment, particularly through this human rights lens, I think is the framework, Julie, that you used, versus even a pro-choice, pro-life lens, perhaps.
So one of the things that I keep saying is the majority of Americans actually believe in reproductive choice. Okay.
About 70% support the right to choose,
correct.
I believe.
So we don't have to engage the people who are dead set against us. We don't have to change their minds. We're not going to change their minds. But we do have to get the people who believe like we do to make it a more important issue among all the things they care about. Okay, so we have to increase what in politics is called the saliency level of the issue. Anti-abortion people always vote anti-abortion, straight down the line. Okay, that's their most important issue. We need to make sure that the people who support us also make their voices heard within the political process. So that's number one. We're not trying to change minds. We're just trying to activate those who already believe what we do. And the second, and I think this is really important, is in the same way that the issue of racial justice should not only be on, African Americans to raise the issue, it shouldn't just be on women to raise the issue. And I think we, in too often, don't require the men in our lives to participate in this issue. Some do, some don't, but if it's a choice between going to the march and going golfing, a lot of families, the guy will go, out with his buddies and not go to the march. And we have to hold our loved ones to a standard that this is an issue that affects all people, regardless of gender, and that they all have to be responsible. So I'm of the view of, let's get our friends, convince our friends to get more active, to make this more important, and to get men more involved in this issue.
And it's not something we have to be shy about. I mean, the numbers are that it depends on the survey. Either 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 women in this country have had an abortion. So it's a very common medical procedure. Everybody knows somebody who has had an abortion. And so I think the fact that people support it, the fact that people have had abortions mean that there's a lot of people who are going to be glad to hear other people speaking about it and maybe don't raise their own voices. But the more we talk about, the more we assert it as a human right, the more it becomes something that we can all be, bringing others along with, being more forthright, removing some of the shaming and stigma that happens. And, Thanksgiving isn't that far away as far as do's and don'ts. I'm not sure you have to go there at Thanksgiving, but there are plenty of other opportunities and conversations. And I do think that, conversations in real life, I think our best online conversations are also effective, and just speaking up more and really acknowledging that this is not about religion. It's not about when life begins, but it's about human rights, and it's about our deeply held beliefs as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you mentioned broadening this beyond a women's health issue. We have a slogan, I guess I should say, on the walls of the Tia Clinic in New York City that says, women's health is an our problem, not a her problem, that I think speaks to the ethos of what you're saying, both with respect to abortion, but also, again, every other healthcare issue that affects women, of which there are many. And I think
You
if
get a
we
t-shirt with
start,
that slogan. I really like that.
yes, I know we should make those. We can do that. We're good at that. It's a great one. I feel really, and we are really proud to have amazing men that work at TIA that believe that day in, day out are part of our mission and our vision. And I think that is really core, not just to, again, abortion or reproductive rights, but childcare, parental leave, the changing vernacular that we're having around these things. We see patients who bring their partner with them to choose their birth control method. I love seeing it. There's this delicate balance of this isn't it. We want to empower our individual patients to make this decision for themselves, but also empower them to do it with their partner if that's right for them. So I see these things happening in our practice and in our communities, and I think it's really exciting and indicative of a turning point. And if we can mobilize not just 51% of the population, but 100% of the population, that makes that 30% of Americans who don't believe in these rights a lot smaller, right? And so I think that's a really important tactic for us all to remember. So with that, I think I wanted to just thank you both so much for taking the time. I wanted to thank everyone for joining this conversation and encourage you all, if you're interested in learning more about the legal history, the opportunities, the necessity to invest in new policy changes to protect and advance reproductive freedom and women's health and rights more broadly, to consider getting this amazing book that I've been digging into, Controlling Women by Kitty and Julie, and have really learned so much from it. That's informed my personal beliefs, but a lot of many things we're thinking about with TIA's role in this movement more broadly. So thank you for writing the book, and I encourage all of you to consider picking up a copy as well. Any last things you want to leave us all with this afternoon or this evening?
Well, the only thing I would add, and thanks Caroline for sponsoring this and for all of the people that have joined, the thing I would add is that doing something is the most important thing. Getting active, taking one step today and another step tomorrow. I don't care what it is, but do something, because that will contribute to the savior of our rights going forward.
Yeah, and I wanted to thank you all for joining us. And Carolyn, it's been delightful to be in conversation with you. I've learned a lot, and I look forward to seeing TIA's growth. And I love having mental health care and this, full woman kind of approach to it. And yeah, for the people who work for you, I think are already doing so much. It's great to have this kind of outlook and priorities within a healthcare setting, and it's more important than ever. So grab a friend, a relative, or a legislature, and keep spreading the word and doing what you're doing.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. And I'm excited to feel really motivated to go do something and take action. So I hope everyone else leaves here feeling motivated as well. So have a great evening, and looking forward to continuing the conversation with all of you in the future.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you. Bye.